The worst decisions are never the ones you plan. They're the ones you make because fear leaves you no time to think. I had exactly 30 seconds to disappear before the men behind me caught up. The rain blurred every traffic light into a smear of red and gold across the windshield of parked cars lining the narrow Brooklyn street. My lungs burned. My sneakers splashed through ankle-deep water as I wrapped both arms around my swollen belly, trying to shield the tiny life growing inside me from a world that suddenly wanted us both gone. 7 months pregnant wasn't supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to be nursery colors, baby names, and wondering whether my son would have my freckles or his father's smile. Instead, every heartbeat sounded like a countdown. I didn't look back again. I couldn't. The sound of hurried footsteps echoing somewhere behind me was enough. Maybe they were only a block away. Maybe closer. I reached the corner just as a black SUV rolled to a stop beneath a flickering street lamp. Dark windows. Engine running. No rideshare sticker. No taxi sign. Nothing made sense except one desperate thought. Hide. Before I could question myself, I pulled open the rear passenger door and climbed inside, breathing so hard my chest ached. The leather seats smelled expensive, carrying the faint scent of cedar and rain. I slammed the door shut and ducked low, every muscle trembling. Please, I whispered without looking up. Just drive. I'll explain later. Silence answered me. Not awkward silence. Controlled silence. The kind that made the air itself feel heavier. My breathing slowly steadied as I realized the vehicle hadn't moved an inch. My fingers tightened around the strap of my worn canvas bag, while raindrops raced down the tinted window beside me. Then a calm, measured voice came from the front seat. Look at me. I froze. Something about those 3 words made my stomach tighten more than the chase outside ever had. Slowly, almost against my own will, I lifted my eyes toward the rearview mirror. Ice blue eyes met mine. Sharp. Patient. Impossible to read. The man behind the wheel looked like he belonged on the cover of a business magazine until I noticed what truly set him apart. It wasn't the tailored charcoal suit or the silver watch catching the dashboard lights. It was the way he held complete stillness, as though the entire city waited for his next decision. He couldn't have been older than 35. Dark hair. Clean-shaven. A faint scar near his temple almost hidden beneath the dim cabin light. Everything about him radiated quiet authority. Then I noticed the man sitting in the front passenger seat. Then another SUV idling behind us. Then 2 more men outside, each wearing an earpiece, scanning the street without panic. They weren't bodyguards protecting a businessman. They were protecting someone far more dangerous. My heartbeat stumbled. I'd seen his face before. Not in person. On the local news. In newspaper headlines people pretended not to read. Adrian Moretti. The man everyone whispered about, but never named too loudly. A mafia boss. My pulse pounded in my ears as the realization crashed over me. Of all the cars in New York, I had climbed into his. Adrian Moretti did not look away. His eyes stayed on mine through the rearview mirror with the kind of calm that made panic feel loud. Outside, rain drummed against the roof while distant headlights swept across the soaked pavement. I reached for the door handle. Locked. My pulse jumped. Please, I said, forcing the words through a dry throat. I made a mistake. I will get out. He rested one hand on the steering wheel without the slightest hint of urgency. If you open that door now, he replied quietly, you will not make it 10 feet before someone finds you. My fingers stopped moving. He was not guessing. He knew. I swallowed hard and glanced through the rain-covered window. 2 dark SUVs had slowed at the intersection behind us. Their headlights searched the street before continuing forward at a crawl. They were looking for someone. Looking for me. The man in the passenger seat touched the small microphone near his collar. Movement from the west, he said calmly. 3 vehicles. Adrian never looked away from me. Drive. The command was almost gentle. The engine came alive beneath us, and the SUV eased into traffic so smoothly it felt as if the storm itself had made room. I kept expecting sirens, shouting, something dramatic. Instead, there was only rain, windshield wipers, and the quiet confidence of people who never rushed because they never needed to. I hugged my belly tighter as my son shifted inside me, a slow, reassuring movement that almost brought tears to my eyes. Adrian noticed. His gaze dropped for only a second before returning to the road. How far along? He asked. 30 weeks. Have you seen a doctor this week? The question caught me completely off guard. Yes. Any complications? I stared at him. Why do you care? For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Because stress is not good for a mother or her child. I almost laughed at the absurdity of hearing parenting advice from the man half of New York whispered about after dark. You do not even know my name. Charlotte Hayes, he answered without hesitation. My heart nearly stopped. Elementary school teacher. Brooklyn Heights. 26 years old. Every word landed like another raindrop against glass. How? He interrupted before I finished. I know who gets into my vehicle. Silence settled again. I suddenly became aware of every expensive detail surrounding me. The polished wood trim, the soft amber lights inside the cabin, the umbrella folded neatly beside the door. This was a world built on preparation. Nothing happened by accident here. My appearance had been the only unexpected thing tonight. Adrian glanced into the mirror once more. You think those people are chasing you? His voice remained steady. They are not. Confusion replaced fear for a moment. What does that mean? He slowed for a red light, but never seemed concerned by it. Charlotte, he said, almost carefully, they already know exactly where you are. A chill spread through me despite the warmth inside the SUV. Then why have they not stopped us? Adrian looked toward the convoy appearing several blocks behind us before meeting my eyes again. Because they know whose car you climbed into. My mind refused to accept what he had just said. I turned toward the rain-streaked window again, searching the reflections of passing headlights as if they might reveal a different reality. That does not make any sense, I whispered. If they know who you are, why would they keep following us? Adrian rested his elbow lightly against the driver's door, his expression unchanged. Because they are hoping I decide you are not worth the trouble. The words settled over me like cold rain. My heartbeat grew louder than the tires rolling across wet pavement. And if you do? I asked. He looked at me in the mirror for a long second before answering. Then you would already be standing on that sidewalk. Something inside me tightened. He was not threatening me. He was stating a fact with unsettling honesty. The convoy behind us remained several car lengths away, never rushing, never falling back. They simply existed, patient as shadows. The man in the passenger seat glanced at a tablet mounted beside the dashboard. 2 vehicles peeled off, he reported. 1 remains. Adrian nodded once. They are testing boundaries. I frowned. Boundaries? Every city has invisible lines, he replied. Most people never notice them. We crossed another intersection, and almost immediately the SUV behind us slowed before turning down a different street. Another disappeared moments later. Within less than a minute, the road behind us was empty except for ordinary commuters driving home through the storm. I blinked in disbelief. They are gone. Adrian gave the smallest nod. They reached the edge of my territory. I stared at him. Territory. He spoke about neighborhoods the way teachers spoke about school districts or doctors spoke about hospitals. It was simply the way his world worked. My world had been lesson plans, parent conferences, grocery lists, and wondering whether I could afford a safer apartment before the baby arrived. His world moved according to rules no map could ever explain. My son shifted again beneath my coat, and I instinctively rubbed my stomach. Adrian noticed the movement immediately. Does he kick often? I looked up, surprised by the softness in his voice. Mostly when I am nervous. He is telling you he is still fighting. I lowered my eyes. Nobody had spoken about my baby that way before. Not even my obstetrician. For the first time since climbing into the SUV, my breathing slowed. The warmth inside the cabin no longer felt like a trap. It felt strangely safe, and that frightened me almost as much as the chase had. Safe around a man whose name people lowered their voices to mention. Safe inside a vehicle I should never have entered. Adrian's phone vibrated once on the center console. He glanced at the screen without touching it. The passenger looked over first, then quietly said, "We found the apartment." Every muscle in my body stiffened. My apartment? I asked. Neither man answered immediately. Adrian finally spoke without taking his eyes off the road. Charlotte, there is something you need to understand before we arrive. I felt my pulse climbing again. Arrive where? His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the steering wheel. Home is no longer the place you left this evening. The words echoed through my mind long after Adrian stopped speaking. Home was no longer the place I had left. I wanted to argue, to tell him he did not know anything about my apartment or my life. But a quiet fear had already begun to settle deep inside me. The SUV turned through a pair of iron gates that opened before we even slowed down. Beyond them stood a limestone estate tucked behind rows of old maple trees, their branches swaying beneath the storm. It looked less like a mansion and more like a place designed to disappear from the rest of New York. Warm lights glowed behind tall windows, and the rain softened into a gentle rhythm against the roof as we rolled beneath a covered entrance. Before I could reach for the door, someone outside opened it with practiced precision. No one spoke. No one stared. They simply acknowledged Adrian with respectful nods before stepping aside for me. That unsettled me more than anything else had tonight. I was not being treated like a prisoner. I was being treated like a guest whose arrival had somehow been expected. I climbed out carefully, one hand resting beneath my belly. The cool air smelled of wet stone and pine instead of traffic and concrete. Adrian waited until I found my balance before leading the way inside. The entrance hall felt impossibly quiet. Marble floors reflected soft golden light, while bookshelves stretched toward a high ceiling instead of expensive artwork I expected from someone with his reputation. A fire burned steadily across the room, filling the house with warmth that reminded me of winter evenings at my grandmother's farm years ago. It was not what I had imagined. Nothing about Adrian Moretti matched the stories whispered on television. He removed his coat and handed it to an older housekeeper, who smiled kindly at me before disappearing down the hallway. "Tea?" Adrian asked. I stared at him, unsure I had heard correctly. I thought. My voice faded. "You thought this would be different." He finished the sentence without judgment. "Most people do." I lowered myself carefully into a chair near the fireplace, grateful to finally rest my aching feet. The baby shifted again, and I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing through the tightness in my back. Adrian noticed immediately. "Bring Dr. Collins," he said quietly to one of the staff members. I looked up. "No. I do not need a doctor. You have been running through heavy rain under severe stress for nearly an hour," he replied evenly. "I prefer certainty over assumptions." Before I could protest again, another man entered carrying a slim black folder. He placed it on the table in front of Adrian without saying a word. Adrian opened it slowly. His eyes moved across several pages before stopping on one photograph. The calm expression he had worn all evening changed almost imperceptibly. Not fear. Recognition. He turned the folder toward me. My breath caught. It was a photograph of Ethan, the father of my unborn son, smiling outside the small coffee shop where we had met 2 years earlier. My fingertips trembled as I reached toward the picture. "How do you know him?" I whispered. Adrian held my gaze for several silent seconds before answering in the quietest voice I had heard from him all night. "Because your child's father once saved my life, and he made me swear that if anything ever happened to him, I would protect the only family he had left." For several seconds I could not breathe. Ethan had never mentioned Adrian Moretti. Not once. He had told me about long work days, old college friends, and a childhood spent moving from one town to another, but never about a promise that somehow connected our lives. I picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. Ethan looked exactly the way I remembered him on our first date, standing outside the neighborhood coffee shop with a paper cup in one hand, and that easy smile that always made difficult days feel lighter. "He never told me about you," I whispered. Adrian remained standing beside the fireplace, the flames casting shifting shadows across his face. He would not have. His answer came without hesitation. "He wanted you far away from my world." I looked up. "Then why am I here?" His eyes met mine with quiet certainty. "Because his world found you anyway." The room fell silent again. Somewhere deeper in the house a grandfather clock chimed softly, reminding me how late it had become. Everything I believed about Ethan suddenly felt incomplete. I rubbed my forehead, trying to organize thoughts that refused to stay still. "He died in a boating accident last year," I said. "That is what the police told me." Adrian lowered his eyes for the first time since we had met. "I know what they told you." Something in the way he chose those words made my stomach tighten. Before I could ask another question, an older woman entered carrying a tray with chamomile tea, fresh fruit, and warm soup. She smiled gently before setting everything in front of me. "You should eat, Miss Hayes," she said kindly. "The baby has had a very long evening too." I realized then how hungry I was. My hand still shook as I lifted the spoon, but the warmth spreading through my body felt almost unfamiliar after hours of fear. Adrian waited until I had finished several bites before speaking again. Dr. Collins is on his way. He only wants to make certain you and the baby are healthy. I nodded this time instead of arguing. Exhaustion had finally begun replacing adrenaline. A few minutes later, a gray-haired physician entered with a small medical bag. His calm smile reminded me of the obstetrician who had cared for me throughout my pregnancy. He checked my blood pressure, listened carefully to the baby's heartbeat, and smiled with quiet reassurance. "Strong heartbeat," he said. "The little one is handling the excitement better than most adults would." I laughed softly before I realized it. It was the first genuine laugh I had managed since the rain-soaked chase began. As the doctor packed his equipment, my son suddenly kicked hard enough to make me gasp. I placed my hand over the movement instinctively. Adrian noticed from across the room. For a brief moment he hesitated, almost as though asking permission without speaking. Then he stepped closer. "May I?" he asked quietly. I nodded before I had time to question my own decision. His hand rested lightly against the side of my belly, careful and respectful. Almost immediately another tiny kick met his palm. Adrian looked down, and something changed inside his expression. The guarded distance disappeared, replaced by a sadness so deep it almost frightened me. He slowly withdrew his hand and spoke so softly I barely heard him. "He has his father's spirit already." Before I could answer, the man from the SUV entered carrying another sealed folder. He placed it beside Adrian and said only 4 words. "We searched Ethan's office." Adrian opened the folder, studied the first page, and the warmth that had quietly settled over the room vanished from his eyes. "Charlotte," he said carefully, "there is something Ethan kept hidden from everyone, including you." My fingers tightened around the warm teacup as Adrian slowly opened the folder. Every instinct told me I was about to lose another piece of the life I thought I understood. He removed a single envelope first. It looked ordinary, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, except my name was written across the front in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting. My breath caught. "He wrote that 3 weeks before he disappeared," Adrian said quietly. "It was never mailed." My hands trembled as I accepted it. The paper felt worn around the edges, as though someone had carried it for a very long time. I carefully unfolded the letter. "Charlotte, if you are reading this, it means I failed to keep my promise." I closed my eyes for a second as tears blurred the words. Ethan's voice echoed inside my mind with every sentence. He apologized for the secrets he had kept. He apologized for leaving me without answers. But one paragraph made my entire body go still. "If anything ever happens to me, trust Adrian. He is the only man I know who will choose your safety over his own pride." I slowly lowered the letter into my lap. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would he trust you that much?" Adrian walked toward the tall windows overlooking the rain-covered gardens. For several moments, he simply watched the storm. 10 years ago, he finally said, I made a decision that should have ended my life. Ethan happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. He pulled me out before everything collapsed around us. His voice remained calm, but I could hear the weight behind every word. He never asked for money, never asked for favors, only one promise. I looked down at the letter again. "Protect my family." Adrian nodded once. Those were his exact words. The room became painfully quiet. Everything Ethan had hidden suddenly seemed less like deception and more like sacrifice. He had spent years building a peaceful life with me while quietly carrying a burden I had never even suspected. Adrian returned to the table and opened the rest of the folder. Inside were photographs, property records, and copies of financial documents. None of them meant anything to me until he placed one faded photograph beside Ethan's letter. It showed Ethan standing beside an older couple outside a small farmhouse somewhere in the Midwest. Between them stood a little boy with bright blonde hair. "Who was that?" I asked. Adrian studied the picture for a long moment. "That boy disappeared 23 years ago." Confusion spread across my face. "What does that have to do with Ethan?" Adrian slid another document toward me. It was an old birth certificate with several sections blacked out. Only one name remained visible: Ethan Carter. Below it, another line had been added years later by hand. "Protected identity authorized." I stared at the page, unable to understand what I was seeing. "He was never supposed to be found," Adrian said quietly. "Someone spent decades making certain his real identity stayed buried." My heartbeat quickened again. Then why is anyone looking now? Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the folder one last time and removed a tiny silver key attached to a faded blue ribbon. Because before he died, he said, placing the key gently into my hand, Ethan left something behind that everyone believes your son will one day inherit. The tiny silver key felt impossibly light in my palm, yet somehow heavier than everything else that had happened that night. I turned it over between my fingers, studying the faded blue ribbon tied around its ring. It looked ordinary, the kind of key someone would forget in the bottom of a drawer. But people had chased me through the rain because of whatever it unlocked. I looked up at Adrian. What does it open? He shook his head slowly. That is the one answer Ethan never gave me. I frowned. Then why would anyone believe my son is connected to it? Adrian folded the documents back into the folder with deliberate care. Because rumors survive longer than truth. Somewhere along the way, people stopped searching for Ethan. They started waiting for his heir. The word lingered in the room. Heir. I had spent months worrying about diapers, doctor appointments, and whether I could afford a crib without using another credit card. Other people were apparently planning futures around a child who had not even been born yet. None of it felt real. I rose from the chair and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the rain. The gardens outside glistened beneath soft lights, peaceful enough to belong to another world entirely. I cannot stay here, I whispered. Adrian remained silent behind me. If they are after me because I am here, then leaving protects everyone. It does not, he answered calmly. I turned to face him. You do not know that. His expression never changed. I know it better than you do. I wrapped both arms around my belly as another gentle kick reminded me that every decision I made belonged to two people now instead of one. Fear had always been easier when I only had myself to lose. Charlotte, Adrian continued. People searching for your child have already spent months gathering information. They know your routines, your apartment, your work, your doctor's office. Leaving this house tonight would not erase any of that. His words settled heavily inside me because deep down I knew he was right. Even before tonight, I had noticed unfamiliar cars parked near my building more than once. Strange phone calls with nobody speaking. Small moments I had dismissed because they seemed too insignificant to matter. Now every memory returned with terrifying clarity. The older housekeeper quietly entered carrying folded blankets. She smiled warmly before placing them over the sofa. The guest room is ready whenever Miss Hayes feels tired, she said before disappearing again. Guest room, not locked room, not guarded room. I looked around the house once more. Nobody had raised their voice. Nobody had forced me to stay. Adrian simply stood there waiting for my decision. That unsettled me more than pressure ever could have. Why are you giving me a choice? I finally asked. His answer came without hesitation. Because Ethan trusted you with his future. I will not dishonor that trust by taking away your own. Before I could respond, the quiet man from the SUV hurried into the room, carrying a ringing phone. His calm expression had vanished for the first time all night. He handed the device to Adrian without a word. Adrian listened for only a few seconds before his eyes narrowed slightly. He ended the call and looked directly at me. Someone entered your apartment less than 10 minutes ago, he said quietly. They did not come looking for your belongings. They were looking for you. Sleep never came that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined my empty apartment, the tiny nursery corner I had spent months putting together one paycheck at a time, and strangers searching through the only place that had ever truly belonged to me. Just before sunrise, I wandered quietly into the kitchen, unable to ignore the restless feeling in my chest. The estate was almost silent. Fresh coffee filled the air, and beyond the tall windows the rain had finally stopped, leaving the gardens wrapped in pale morning light. I found Adrian standing alone near the breakfast table, already dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, reading several reports spread neatly across the polished wood. He looked up as I entered. You should still be resting, he said. I shook my head. I cannot rest while someone is looking for my child. He folded the papers without arguing. Neither can I. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he slid one photograph across the table. It showed my apartment building taken sometime before dawn. Nothing appeared unusual until I noticed the small white flowers sitting beneath my mailbox. My stomach tightened. Those were not there yesterday. Adrian nodded. Neither was the man who delivered them. I looked closer. Hidden inside the bouquet was a folded card. The photograph had been enlarged enough for me to read a single sentence written in black ink. "We know where the air belongs." A chill traveled through me despite the warmth of the room. "They wanted you to see this?" I asked. "No," Adrian answered quietly. "They wanted me to." He placed another document beside the photograph. Security footage from the building showed a delivery driver leaving the flowers before calmly walking away. Nothing looked suspicious, yet Adrian studied every frame with remarkable patience. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "People rarely reveal themselves," he replied, "but they always reveal habits." He pointed toward the corner of one image where a silver sedan had remained parked during the entire delivery. "Same vehicle that appeared near your doctor's office 2 weeks ago." My heart skipped. "How could you possibly know that?" He met my eyes. "Because after Ethan disappeared, I quietly watched over the life he left behind." I stared at him in disbelief. "You have been protecting me for a year." "Trying to," he corrected gently, "without letting you know." Suddenly, dozens of moments I had dismissed as coincidence rushed back into my memory. The security guard who had insisted on walking me to my car after late parent conferences. The mechanic who refused to charge me after replacing my brakes. The anonymous payment that had covered 1 month of prenatal medical bills when my insurance delayed approval. I looked at Adrian with completely different eyes. "That was you." He did not answer, which was answer enough. Before I could speak again, the front doors opened and the quiet man from the SUV entered with visible urgency. He placed a small evidence bag on the table. Inside rested a silver locket recovered from the flowers. Adrian opened it carefully. Tucked inside was an old photograph of Ethan as a young man standing beside someone whose face had been deliberately cut away. Folded beneath the picture was another handwritten message. This time it contained only 6 words. "We remember the promise he broke first." The message stayed in my thoughts for days. "We remember the promise he broke first." I read those words so many times that they no longer looked like ordinary handwriting. They looked like a door Ethan had tried desperately to keep closed. A week passed beneath the quiet protection of Adrian's estate. For the first time in months, I slept through an entire night without waking from nightmares. Dr. Collins visited every morning, always leaving with the same reassuring smile after listening to my son's strong heartbeat. The housekeeper insisted I eat more than I thought possible, and somehow every room that had once felt unfamiliar slowly became comforting. Yet the greatest surprise was Adrian himself. The man the city feared spoke softly to the gardeners, remembered every employee's name, and somehow always appeared with a chair before I realized my back had started hurting. One afternoon, I found him standing alone beside the nursery that had quietly been prepared for the baby. The walls were painted a warm shade of blue-gray, and sunlight spilled across a wooden crib built by hand rather than bought from a luxury store. "You planned this?" I asked. Adrian looked down for a moment before answering. "Ethan once told me that every child deserves one room in the world where fear is never allowed inside." My eyes filled with tears. "He really said that?" Adrian smiled faintly. "He repeated it every time we argued." Weeks later, my son arrived on a quiet autumn morning surrounded not by panic, but by kindness. Dr. Collins guided us with calm confidence while the house filled with hopeful anticipation instead of fear. When I finally heard my baby's first cry, every secret, every chase, every sleepless night faded beneath that single beautiful sound. They placed him gently in my arms, and for several minutes the world became wonderfully small. Just me and the little boy who had already changed so many lives before taking his first breath. Adrian remained near the doorway, giving us space until I looked up and nodded. Only then did he step closer. His usually steady hands seemed almost uncertain as I carefully placed my son into his arms. The baby opened sleepy blue eyes, studied Adrian for a long moment, and wrapped tiny fingers around one of his. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, overcome by an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Your father kept his promise after all." I smiled through happy tears. "No," I said softly. "You kept it for him." Months later, life looked different than I ever imagined. I returned to teaching 3 mornings each week while my son filled every quiet corner of the estate with laughter. The silver key remained safely locked away until the day he would be old enough to decide what to do with the truth Ethan had protected. One crisp afternoon, Adrian waited outside my school in the same black SUV where our lives had first collided. He stepped out, opened the passenger door with that familiar calm, and looked at me with the smallest smile. Still afraid of getting into my car? I laughed, adjusting my son against my shoulder before walking toward him. Only if you ever stop driving us home. As we disappeared beneath the golden light of the setting sun, I finally understood something Ethan had known long before I did. Sometimes destiny does not arrive looking gentle. Sometimes it wears the face the whole world fears, only to become the safest place your heart will ever find.